Hello and welcome to another episode of the Awareness Podcast, the analysis of and responses to extremist narratives, where we explore the depths of extremist narratives across Europe. I'm your host, Firdaus Alawi, and today we are delving into the shared historical legacies between Serbia and Croatia.
The Republic of Serbia is a landlocked country at the crossroads of Southeast and Central Europe with a population of just over 7 million inhabitants. In the northwest, it borders the Republic of Croatia, a country of nearly 4 million people and the most recent EU member, as it joined the Union in 2013 and implemented euro as national currency in 2023. Serbia, on the other hand, was accepted as an official EU candidate country in 2012, but since then, not much progress has been made regarding that concern. Balkan has for centuries been a disputed area, with the presence of invading empires from the east, principally the Ottomans, and from Central Europe, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Furthermore, local kingdoms and empires have existed with the names of both Croatia and Serbia at different periods of history. Focusing at the last 100 years, as the Serbian Gavrilo Princip famously started the First World War by shooting Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the Austro-Hungarian Empire soon collapsed and the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was proclaimed in 1918, later changing its name into the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It lasted until 1945 and the Axis invasion, establishing an Axis puppet state known as the Independent State of Croatia, led by the fascist Ustaše regime in the western parts. However, Yugoslavia is commonly described as the only European country to liberate itself during the Second World War, and with the victory of the communist partisans, the monarchy was abolished and a one-party state was established after the war, while communist purges took place. Both Croatia and Serbia became constituent republics of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, with its capital in Belgrade. Though a communist country, it pursued a policy of neutrality during the Cold War and became a founding member of the non-aligned movement. After Tito's death in 1980, the Yugoslav economy began to collapse and the 80s saw an economic crisis as well as rising ethnic nationalism and political dissidence. With the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the effort to transition into a confederation failed and Croatia and Slovenia were the first two republics to declare independence in 1991. This led to the Croatian War of Independence between Croat forces loyal to the government of Croatia and the Serb-controlled Yugoslav People's Army. The Battle of Vukovar in 1991, an 87-day-long siege of a small city in eastern Croatia by the Yugoslav People's Army supported by Serbian paramilitary forces, was one of the most important events of the war, and Vukovar is today one of the centers of the Croatian right-wing organizations. Furthermore, in Croatia, the war is referred to as the Homeland War, a word inspiring the Homeland Movement, a nationalist and right-wing populist political party formed in 2020 in Croatia. In European elections of 2024, the Homeland Movement gained 9% of the Croatian votes. From the Serbian perspective, the center of attention is the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999, as airstrikes lasted for 3 months during the Kosovo War. The bombings continued until an agreement was reached that led to the withdrawal of the Yugoslav army from Kosovo. Today, the NATO bombings play an important role as an anti-Western aspect in Serbian national narratives. In 2006, the union with Montenegro ended and Serbia was an independent state for the first time since 1918. 2 years later, the Parliament of Kosovo declared independence from Serbia, and Kosovo's sovereignty is today recognized by 104 countries, including all but 5 EU members. However, it is not recognized by Serbia. Since 2012, Serbia is ruled by the Serbian Progressive Party, with its root in the Serbian Radical Party, an ultra-nationalist party founded in 1991. Their leader, Aleksandar Vučić, has served as Prime Minister and President of Serbia since 2012. He is notably a former Minister of Information in Milosevic's Serbia in the 90s, the former Yugoslav president who became the first sitting head of state charged with war crimes. In the elections of 2023, the parliamentary group Serbia Must Not Stop, led by the Serbian Progressive Party, gained 48% of the votes.
Today, we have with us historian Isidora Grubački from the Institute of Contemporary History of Ljubljana. Thank you so much for joining us today, Isidora.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. So, like always, before we delve into the episode, I want to introduce you a bit and to talk a bit about your work. So the episode makes a bit more sense, like why are you here and why we're talking about this. So Isidora is a historian working in the field of contemporary history, and her main focus so far on political history of feminism is in the first half of the 20th century. She works at the Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana, like we said, and is also a member of the team of researchers at the ERC-funded project, the history of feminist political thoughts and women's rights discourses in East Central Europe from 1929 to 2009 at the University of Vienna. And she has published about interwar feminism in Yugoslavia, and most recently she has co-edited a forthcoming Rutleck edited volume on crisis discourses in East Central Europe. Isidora, that was quite a complete introduction, but if you could tell us a bit more about your work, especially when it comes to arenas?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, actually, my work for arenas is something that, for the first time, actually, I began to explore more as a researcher, more contemporary period, and actually extremist narratives in contemporary Serbia and Croatia. But of course, for this kind of research, my previous research came quite useful because, as I will talk a bit later, there is these narratives from the 19th century and from the interwar period, particularly, which is the period which I focused on in my previous research, are quite important. And actually, research in contemporary extremist narratives is not possible without looking at historical roots, which are actually, of course, quite older. So for the Arenas project, I explored, as I said, Serbian and Croatian context, and I will be happy to talk about that a bit more with you today.
Yes, definitely. So we're going to start with that, actually, with historical roots. So for starters, I want to ask you, could you provide some historical context for our listeners about the shared legacies between Serbia and Croatia, particularly the Kingdom of Yugoslavia from 1918 to 1941?
Yes, thank you for your question. So one of my tasks for Arenas was, as I said, to explore Serbia and Croatia, and this was my decision for the project and for this discussion today, is to talk about these two case studies together, exactly because of the shared legacy of Serbs and Croats living in a country that was called Yugoslavia, which was throughout the majority of the 20th century. And the shared legacy results in quite comparable extremist narratives today, actually. So when it comes to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later called Kingdom of Yugoslavia, this was Yugoslavia during the interwar period, unlike the socialist Yugoslavia from post-45 period. There are, of course, many things that could be said about the kingdom, but perhaps one of the most important aspects for today's discussion is that Yugoslavia had many conflicting nation projects. Among them, Yugoslav, Serbian, and Croatian, and others, of course. And all these reached back to the 19th century. So some of the names and idioms from this period are still recurring in contemporary discourses. And there are perhaps two main points which I could emphasize here as important for understanding better the contemporary extremist narratives. The first is the ideas of Greater Serbia and Greater Croatia, which go back to at least 19th century. In the Croatian context, one name that has been coming up for over a century is the name of Ante Starčević, whose Party of Rights has been one of the bases for Croatian nationalism. And to give an example, recently the Croatian right-wing party, the Homeland Movement, has shared a photo of him on Twitter, calling him one of the quote, biggest promoters of love towards Croatia. So we see that this is like a kind of a name that comes up all the time. And similarly, Serbian nationalism has been rooted in the 19th century idea of Great Serbia, the idea of all Serbs living in the same state, which of course would not be possible without, eliminating some of the other nations which would also which live on these lands. And this idea envisioned that the Middle Ages Serbia should be resurrected. And this is when the myth of Kosovo became prominent also in the Serbian nationalist imaginary as the place of the birth of the Serbian nation. So the second, let's say, root of extremist narratives can be found in the late 1930s when both Serbian and Croatian nationalisms were getting stronger. And to give some examples, at this time in Serbia, some of the leading right-wing intellectuals were Nikola Velimirović and Dimitrije Ljotić, who will become important inspiration for the contemporary Serbian right-wing parties. Velimirović thought and his conceptualization of Svetosavlje is important. The Svetosavlje, this is the idea named by the founder and the first archbishop of the Serbian church, Saint Sava. And this actually merged Serbian nationalism with orthodoxy. This is a conception of religion that is actually still, in a way, let's say, mainstream today. And at the time, it had a close affinity with the para-fascist organization of Dimitrije Ljotić's Zbor, which was an organization in Yugoslavia openly promoting anti-Semitism. And of course, at the time, it clashed the most with the communists. And members of Zbor hailed Hitler and Mussolini, for instance. So this is, I think, important for understanding the context of the 30s. And on the other hand, in Croatia, there was a rise in the Ustaša movement of Ante Pavelić with the ideology that fused fascism, Roman Catholicism, and Croatian ultranationalism and supported the idea of Great Croatia. And then these movements would, of course, play an important role after the Second World War broke in Yugoslavia in 1941. Particularly in the case of independent state of Croatia, which was a Nazi puppet state led by the fascist Ustaša movement, which I just mentioned. And it's important maybe to end with saying that both these nationalist extremist currents were opposed to the partisan movement. So their recurrence in contemporary narratives is also tightly intertwined with anti-communism, which is actually important for most of the contemporary extremist narratives in Europe today, not only in post-Yugoslav states, and it's also connected with erasing of the Yugoslav socialist legacy.
Mm-hmm. So taking from here, from after the Second World War, and also talking about communism, I want to ask you, so the partitions led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia took over the power and founded the Second Socialist Yugoslavia. Yet this country broke up in the 1990s. Could you elaborate on the importance of the Yugoslav 1990s was for the contemporary extremist narratives?
Yes. When it comes to the Yugoslav wars, these are perhaps the major element of difference between maybe extremist narratives in some other European countries and the ones in post-Yugoslav countries, especially Croatia and Serbia. The Yugoslav wars were a series of ethnic conflicts in the 1990s, which, as you said, brought Yugoslavia to an end in the most tragic way. And to talk about this would be quite a different topic, which I actually don't consider myself an expert on. And I feel somehow that mentioning some of the important elements of the Yugoslav wars and not mentioning all of it would be problematic. But I will just mention some that are going to be important in some illustrations later. So I will mention the Croatian War of Independence with actually a mainstream but ideologically saturated name of Domovinski Rat, the Homeland War. This is something that will come up in some examples, which I plan to give later. This war was between 91 and 95. And particularly important here is the siege of the Yugoslav People's Army of the town of Vukovar in 1991. Supported by paramilitary forces from Serbia. Many people, including civilians, unfortunately were killed, and the town was almost completely destroyed. And then when it comes to the Bosnian War, which was from 92 to 1995, it is essential to mention the Srebrenica genocide in 1995, when Bosnian Serbian army killed around 8,000 Muslim boys and men. And what I would like to emphasize is that in this period, in the 1990s, there was a recycling of the previously mentioned tropes and narratives concerning Greater Serbia, Croatian right for state, as well as the resurgence of the 1930s and the Second World War interethnic conflicts. An example here is the resurgence of the legacy of the Ustaša movement, as in Croatia during the war, the Ustaša official greeting "Za dom spremni," which means ready for the homeland, which was at the time used instead of Heil Hitler. There was a resurgence of this greeting, let's say, because we know that in the 1990s, Croatian Party of Rights in Croatia and its paramilitary organization, the Croatian Defense Forces, their official salute was "Za dom spremni," the aforementioned salute of the Ustaša. And the rise of this salute in contemporary context is actually also quite interesting, and it was shown recently by researcher Katarina Damčević, so I would like to actually recommend her articles in understanding for how in social media today this is used in different contexts.
So taking now here from the use or like the bringing up the past and such, I want to switch the conversation a bit to the current picture. And how like right now is the situation in both countries. So the emergence of right-wing political parties such as the Serbian Radical Party and the Croatian Party of Rights marked a significant shift in the political landscape during and after the wars. How did these parties shape the narrative and extremist ideologies in both countries?
Well, this is quite important because actually the war was the context in which new post-socialist political parties were established. But although there were new political parties, some of them drew back on the 19th century traditions, which I already and interwar traditions, which I already mentioned. This is the case with this, I just mentioned it in previous response, the Croatian Party of Rights in Croatia, which was from the 1990s supposed to continue the earlier mentioned 19th century program of Ante Starčević. And on the other hand, in Serbia, the major right-wing party of the period is the Serbian Radical Party, again named after a Serbian political party from 19th century, which was also one of the leading parties in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And the leader of the Serbian Radical Party was and still is actually Vojislav Šešelj, who was convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia for his role in the deportation of Croats from Hrtkovci. So the war context, of course, is still here present. And this party is the key for understanding also contemporary politics in Serbia, because what came out of the Serbian Radical Party is the Serbian Progressive Party of the current president, Aleksandar Vučić, who had been a part of the Radical Party for a long time. And he is still actually in power due to complete media control and what many have argued recently were actually rigged elections. So it is a fact that Vučić was in the 1990s as a member of the Radical Party, the Minister of Information, and that in 1995 in the parliament as a MP, he said, "You kill one Serb and we will kill 100 Muslims." So what I want to emphasize here overall is that in the 1990s, there was a certain kind of reuse and adaptation of historical narratives from the Second World War and from earlier periods, and that the war context played a significant role in the radicalization of these parties' political narratives. And as I showed with this one example, but there are also many, but I thought that this one was the most important. in many cases, this is still the case.
Yes, and it clearly shows the what we're talking about, specifically these narratives or like this road towards extremism. So, Isidora, I have so many more questions to ask you and to follow up with what we're talking about. But unfortunately, we don't have so much time. So I do want to shift a bit the conversation to one last question, and it's about gender. We talked about how the history of both countries and this legacy of wars and this legacy of like this divided nation as well, or divided nations, have played a role in extremist narratives. But when it comes to gender, could you discuss how these narratives relate to it?
Yeah, well, in my view, the extremist narratives regarding gender cannot be disentangled from these narratives related to nation, as the rise of nationalism and retraditionalization, which has went on since at least the 1990s, of course, connected to the war, as I just mentioned, is also tightly connected with erasing the socialist legacies. And women's emancipation, in broad terms, is definitely one of the key legacies of socialist Yugoslavia. And then with this retraditionalization or repatriarchalization of society came back again the more conservative ideas about family and nation, whose roots are in the conservative and fascist ideas of the first half of the 20th century, or like some roots are in it. So one such example is, for instance, the organization Klečavci, which means those who kneel. And their official name is Muževni budite, be manly. And it's an organization from Croatia. And they can be described maybe the best as Catholic fanatics who gather once a month to kneel in the squares across Croatia. And they demand, what they demand is actually a nice illustration of this return to these conservative narratives. And I will give you a quote now to give you a better idea of what they actually demand. They say they demand homeland. So again, we have the homeland concept here. Homeland, peace, and the conversion of the Croatian nation, for men to become spiritual authorities in the family who will bravely witness and transmit the Catholic faith, for a life of premarital chastity, for chastity in clothing and behavior, and for the renewal of Catholic marriages. And they also demand the end of abortion, openness of married couples towards the life, whatever that would mean, etc. So here we see again this combination of discourse of homeland, of nation, of family, of premarital chastity, etc. And the church also plays a role in this, of course, but I won't get into that now because there's something else that I wanted to also emphasize. That even though I still consider this framework of repatriarchalization useful to interpret the extremist narratives regarding gender, these developments are actually not linear, and some paradoxes can be emphasized. And one such paradox that is interesting to me is that of right-wing women, which has been, historians such as Clarice Berthezen and Julie Gottlieb have dealt with this phenomenon in scholarly ways, and there are some recent popular culture forms that explore this. For instance, for me, the most interesting were the series Handmaid's Tale and Miss America. And there are two interesting examples from Serbia and Croatia. One is Milica Đurđević-Stamenkovski, who is the leader of the Zavetnici Oath Keepers Party, the party named after the Kosovo vow. And after the December 2023 elections, she became the Minister for Family Care and Demography in the new government of Serbia. And one of her recent suggestions in this capacity was to introduce uniforms in schools in colors of the Serbian flag. So I will just leave this example here. I don't think there is a comment needed. And another example, maybe to finish with this, from Croatia, is that of Željka Markić, who is the director of the organization In the Name of the Family in Croatia, and she's one of the organizers of the March for Life section in Croatia. So March for Life, as we know, the worldwide now, unfortunately, movement for anti-abortion. And when it comes to her in this organization, I would like to mention this discrepancy between the March for Life page, which is about a seemingly noble and peaceful thing. As they say, the Walk for Life is a peaceful walk of citizens in support of every born and unborn child, its mother, father, and every family. Yet if you go to the profile of the woman leading this in Croatia, Željka Markić, you can see narratives that are quite similar to those of the Homeland Movement, this right-wing political party in Croatia. With a mix of anti-Yugoslavism, anti-communism, Croatian nationalism, etc. So I think these two examples are quite illustrative of how gender and nation come together again and again, unfortunately, or like anti-gender discourses.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can clearly see the link between these two. And I think I have been seeing a pattern throughout the countries that we keep analyzing on this podcast, where in these countries, we tend to see that there is a need or a want to go back to old times, or like when things were good, especially when it comes to gender roles. Going back to that, or going back to the tradition. And yet we do see political leaders or public figures that are women who are advocating to go back to the gender role. So like you say, like there's this paradox, or like there's this discrepancy between what they say and like how they portray it, because it's not like men are going outside alone and saying this, but like there are also women that advocate for this. So it is very interesting to see. So unfortunately, we will have to finish the episode here, but I do want to thank you again, Isidora, for having this conversation with us.
Thank you so much again for inviting me. It was and for asking all these questions. It was really nice for me also to share the research that I did for Arenas, and I look forward to other opportunities as well. And I hope that that my responses were informative.
Yes, absolutely. They were amazing. Thank you so much again. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode. We will see you in the next one. Bye.
This podcast is part of the Arenas project, funded by the European Union Horizon Programme, under the Framework Programme for Research and Innovation, 2021 to 2027. Speaker voice, Gabriel Wahl.